Welcome to the Day in History for May 13th. Today we're going to talk about the Dust Bowl. Yes, because today, yesterday, this time was when the Great Dust Bowl was sweeping across the U.S. prairies. Now there's a lot of interesting stuff to learn about the Dust Bowl, and there's a lot of things that impacted it, and we're going to see what we can do about that today. So the big idea is that some lessons are learned the hard way. And boy, did we learn some hard lessons about farming. Now, I'll let you write this down. Let's get going. We are in the United States. We're in the middle section of the United States. And I couldn't really put up a map with Google Maps of the exact location. So, yeah, you'll get a better idea of it in just a sec. Now, this is what the Dust Bowl looked like. This is an iconic image of the Dust Bowl. Look at this cloud. This is a cloud of dust blowing across the plains. It was absolutely amazing. I would highly suggest that for follow-up from this day in history, that you Google Dust Bowl images and just look at some of the pictures because they're absolutely amazing and they're frightening. I listened to a PBS documentary about the Dust Bowl, and there were people that they thought that the end of the world was coming because when they saw this dark dust cloud coming in, they really thought that the world was ending, and they started praying, and they thought the world was over because of what it looked like. It was really scary. I couldn't even imagine what it would have looked like if you were a kid. But let's talk about what actually caused the Dust Bowl. And there's a lot of stuff to cover first. And I'm not even going to get into the parts about the Great Depression because the Dust Bowl is often kind of lumped into the Great Depression, but they're separate things. They did have an impact on each other, but one did not cause the other. So let's get going. Now, we have to go back to the Civil War. Now, once the Civil War got over, there was this push to move west. We call it westward expansion. There's all this open land, the war's over, people were just kind of done, and they said, you know what, we're gonna move west. Many people went to Oregon, California, Washington, and that area, but a lot of people settled in the plains. Now, the plains is this area here, and this is what many call the Great American Desert. Now, it's not a desert that's filled with sand dunes and stuff. Like when I think desert, I think Sahara Desert, like by Egypt, and like the crazy hot sun and the sand dunes and camels and stuff. No, this is the Great American Desert, which was primarily grassland. Now, if we look at this, there's something called the 100th meridian. And the 100th meridian kind of marks this line through America that separates what we call semi-arid. Now remember, arid's a word of the day. Arid means like not a lot of water. So semi, not a lot of water, and the humid areas. And if you look at the map, you can totally see the difference in color, the green and the brown, right? So they don't get quite as much, they don't get as much water. And so when they moved west, when the settlers moved west, many people didn't think that it was a good place to farm, but people did it anyway. Now, there was this theory that when I say it now, it seems absolutely absurd, but there was this theory that said that the rains will follow the plow. Now, the plow is what digs the holes in the ground for the plants, and there was this theory that people believe that if you go and start a farm and start planting, that action will cause the rains to come. I don't know. I'm gonna have to do some more research on this, but it's a thing. People thought that if you started planting, that the rains would come, that your action of planting would somehow cause the climate to drop rain. Well, that's not true. And we know that's not true now. But apparently at this time period, people believed it was true, and so they started farms in areas that, weren't very good to farm in. Now, farming throughout all of human history up until about this time in the 1920s, 1910s was done like this. Okay, some version of this. People used animals, they used tools, and they harvested themselves. Now, this made it so that the farms were only as big as the number of people you had, right? Now, as we move closer to the 1910s, 1920s, World War I, we start to get something called mechanization of farming. Okay, or like think of the Industrial Revolution, how we talked about factories, how we went from craftsmen making individual items and then selling those individual items to factories and assembly lines. Well, we took that assembly line and we put it on farms. Now, this is kind of an interesting picture of a half mechanized, half animal drawn thing. And what happened was eventually we get to this. We get to tractors. We get to a single farmer that can now do the work of a lot of different people and animals. Now, I'm not even going to get into the economics or the cost of this because these tractors were super expensive. And so farmers often had to take out a loan or they had to borrow money to buy the tractors in hopes that they would make a lot of money from the farming to pay it off. That actually has to do with the Great Depression part. But we now have mechanized farming, and these farms got big. Now, if you look at this graph, this is a really good graph to look at. It shows you the number of farms, okay, and then the average size of the farm. Okay, so the solid line, as it goes up, you can see at the very peak, the very top, that's the Dust Bowl. And then what happens afterward? Boom, it goes down because there was a big problem. Now, at the same time, you get a drought. Now, a drought is when it doesn't rain, right? Now, the world has a cycle, our climate has a cycle, and there are cycles of drought. There's droughts in California, there's droughts all over the place. It just so happened that there was a drought at the same time that we were massively increasing the number of farms that we had and how big they were. Now, if you look, you can see this dip down here. I'm probably not pointing at it. Maybe I am. I don't know. I'm going to think it's right about here. Now, there was no rain. Like areas that used to get a decent amount of rain in the American desert, they stopped getting rain. And you know what happened? All the plants died. Here's another problem. Since the early 1900s, farmers had been practicing some not very good farming techniques. They were planting the same crop over and over and over again. And they cut all the grass. Now the desert, the Great American Desert, was the Great Plains. It was filled with prairie land and grasses. Now grasses are really good at holding soil together. Even if the grass dies, the dead grass can still hold the soil in the ground. But what the farmers did is they went through and they cut down all the grass and they planted other crops that didn't hold the soil. And so what happened is when the drought hit and the crops died, all that was left was the dirt, the soil. There was no grass to keep it in place. And this happened. The soil started to blow away. In some areas, 75%, so 3/4 of the dirt, the topsoil, the good soil on top, simply blew away into giant dust clouds. And this happened all over the place. Now, the most affected areas are right around here. And it was bad. I mean, it was so bad, like I mentioned earlier, people thought that like the world was ending. It was this dark dust cloud, like some monster rolling across the horizon, coming for your town. Can you imagine drinking coffee in a little shop in 1935 and looking out the window, or 1934 and looking out the window and seeing a black cloud covering the entire horizon, like the trail of some giant horse? Pretty crazy. So, it was bad. Now, I'm going to show you a few pictures of the Dust Bowl. I want you guys to look these up because the Dust Bowl is actually something you're going to study in middle school and high school as well. So this is kind of a good, what I call a primer or a good introduction to the Dust Bowl. Pretty interesting stuff. Look at this. The soil turned areas into like what looks like an actual desert. I saw some pictures that it looked like some American farmer was standing in the Sahara Desert. It is crazy. Look at this. Like, this used to be a farm. There used to be a family running around with water and green plants, and now it's like a desert. It was pretty sad. Now, they did figure some things out from this. Like I said, the big idea is some lessons are learned the hard way. Well, we learned it. We learned that you can't cut down all the things that hold the soil in the ground. And so there was something called the Civilian Conservation Corps that was part of the recovery from the Great Depression. They hired a lot of people to go around and plant all kinds of trees. I think like 3 billion trees were planted. It was a crazy number. And these trees would help break the wind. So like if you have trees, like that kind of stops the wind and it helps hold the soil in the ground. Now, we have learned a lot. We learned that you need to rotate crops. You can't plant the same crop over and over because it kills the soil, takes all those nutrients out, and then it doesn't grow anymore. And then if you stop growing it there, then the wind blows it away. You can terrace it, which means put it at different levels. You can plant different types of crops that help strengthen the soil, and then even put those crops, just grow it and then put it into the soil to help like give it more nutrients. So we've learned a lot, but we kind of learned the hard way because for many years, the Dust Bowl completely destroyed the farming in the area that we talked about. So I would highly suggest you do some more research on the Dust Bowl, and I'll see you tomorrow.